So here is a whole bunch of different shots I had. I just grabbed all the nodes again and hit L to kind of put them in order here. And we're going to go ahead and just kind of look at these and possibly color grade them and just see what's what. So we'll start with yours truly here on the Shot 1 Sony A6300 face exposure. And I'll go ahead and put my viewer to that. Again, I could just grab it and hit 1, come up here and hit F or H to frame. And again, I will set this to input so I can actually kind of scrub across. And what I did was I had a really nice LED light, and I have it at a specific color temperature here, but I'm moving it away from my face and towards my face, and you can see the different levels of exposure. Again, this is footage that's compressed via Sony. It's just what it is. You can't color grade it too much. I talked about this before, where if I come in here and I just color grade this down, yes, there is some detail in there. You know, if I bring it down, but it starts to get muddy. So it's kind of hard to kind of manipulate that, but we're going to go ahead and just jump into the color correction nodes and kind of get started. If you want to know where the color correction nodes, they're located right here under color. And you got to understand something about color correction. Everything in color is a mathematical process, from multiplication, division. There's a whole bunch of options here. There's clamp, color lookup, color space, color transfer, exposure, grade, histogram, hist EQ, hue correct, hue shift, HSV tool. There's a whole bunch. There's this really cool one called match grade, which matches shots, and saturation, soft clip, toe, true light, and so forth. So I'm going to go ahead and just go through the basics that you would need to kind of understand in the midst of all of this insanity. So let's go ahead and just kind of jump in. So I got this clip, and again, I just put my viewer to it. And again, we have normalized values in here. If I hold down Control or Command on a Mac, you can see I can sample certain areas here of pixels, and the values never go outside of 0 to 1. So everything within using color correction, or at least your image itself, usually stays around 0 to 1. 0 meaning black and 1 meaning white. So that is spread across the spectrum of RGB, or red, green, blue. And you can see that with your scopes. So if I go ahead and just take this little properties bin up here, and I can go ahead and split the vertical here, I can go ahead and put additional information in here by clicking here and choosing a specific window. So under window, you can see a new scope, and I can choose histogram, waveform, or vector. So there's a lot you can kind of play there. I'm going to go ahead and choose the waveform. So you can kind of see that. So here it is. I can go ahead and pull it and drag it in. I'll drag it in like right there. There we go. I can move this up and down. And you can go ahead and see that we have values here from 0, which is black, to near 100, which is basically. And as we kind of scrub through, you can see again, it doesn't show up live. If I hit play, I don't get a live feed like some other viewers. But you can see that we're getting a specific value here in the red, green, blue. I can look at this in a parade format. So if you go ahead and take this waveform here, you can click over here to the side, and you can get a parade form, which gives you the red input, the green input, and the blue input. So you can see it's basically the information going across from left to right. So as we go across the face, you can see red increases because we got flesh tones. And then as we move over here, we get higher into blue. You can see how high blue is here. Look how high in blue and green is, which gives you cyan. It's important to really study the color wheel. Color wheel is very important, understanding such aspects as what are your primaries, secondaries, tertiaries, and so forth. To understand what colors, when you take away a color, what does it do? Does it add another color? If you move away from a color, what color does it turn into? Usually when you do spill suppression on green screen, you're pushing everything away from green towards the opposite end of the spectrum, which is magenta or sort of purple. So as you can see, we've got all these different values here, and we can start playing with these independently if we want. I'll just go through another option here. So again, you just go back and forth between the parade. Another little scope we can create, I'll just drag this up, is I'll come over here and go Windows, and actually I pull it way up so you can see. And we'll go Windows, New Scope, and we'll choose Waveform. And let's go ahead and pull that off. You can take these tabs and drag them off and just put them anywhere. It's really cool. I'm sort of just kind of maneuvering spaces here. Anytime you want to close a window, like for instance here, you can click, you can say close tab or close pane. I'll go ahead and hit close pane so that all we have is just 3 panes here. There we go. And okay, so there's waveform. That's interesting. Let me go ahead and see if I can change this again. So new scopes. Oh, I'm sorry, histogram. Oh, there's also vector too. So histogram, we'll go ahead and cover histogram. Here's histogram. I'll just drag that right here, and we'll close down waveform. And then we have this here, which is the histogram. Again, there are many videos understanding what the histogram is, but if you were to basically kind of sum it up, every single pixel on here, we have 1920 by 1080 pixels, right? There's a lot of black pixels in here. You can see there's a ton of black pixels, right? A lot of this is black pixels. And it's taking every pixel and counting it as a specific cube. Imagine if you stack these cubes like Tetris, you know, from top to bottom, or from bottom to top, you would actually have a bunch of cubes for every single pixel that's black is being stacked. So the value of this pixel is at 0. So there's a ton, you can see we've got a ton of stacked little cubes here going all the way up, which is counting for every single pixel, and we have a ton of black pixels. We don't have hardly any pixels, okay, over here in the realm of pure white. Okay, if you kind of come in here and scrub, you can see these values. If I hold down Control, you know, there is no value of anything anywhere near. You know, here we got the hottest item on the scene here, and I can look at that by coming in here and choosing luminance or Y. You can see the brightest parts in the shot are right here and here, and if I just sample those areas, we don't go any higher than, let's say, 0.7. So you got to think of this as a value from 0 to 0.5 to 1. So you can see I don't think we have any pixels, if any, at pure 1. Okay. So just be aware of that as we kind of go through this. I'm going to go ahead and hit R to bring us back to, hit R again to go back to just RGB. Again, you can just pull it on this tab here. So with that said, let's go ahead and look at the final one, which is our scopes. Go over here to scopes for the vector scopes. So I'll go ahead and click on that, and I'll drag that into this window here. And what you start to see, if you take a look at this, really what you're looking at, I'll go ahead and hit tab over here and make a color wheel. And what you're seeing, if I put my viewer to it, and we will switch over to the vector scope, is what you're seeing is, and you can see here it's perfectly sort of laid out here equally in the center here, is because we're looking at value, you know, all of the pixels sort of analyzed in a specific, you know, the color itself, okay, what hue is it kind of pushing towards. So if I put my viewer back to this, you could see a lot of the pixels are in the realm of this saturated blue and green, which is technically cyan, and that's the color you're seeing here, sort of like a teal. Right, combine blue and you know, blue and green, you get cyan. So see a lot of pixels there. These pixels would probably represent all of the pixels that are specifically my face, which is in like skin tone area and so forth. So you're going to see these sort of, all three of these babies sort of shift as we kind of play around a little bit. So I'm going to push my parade back here with these guys for my waveform. And the key is to see where the bottom of the waveform is and the top of the waveform is. And again, you can switch between seeing a ghost of all three and so forth. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and delete this. All right, so let's kind of just get into the basic color grading. And the most common grading tool used in Nuke is the grade node. Now the hotkey for that is G. And again, I can, if I select the node that I create will happen down the pipeline after it, and I'll just hit G. Or I can select this, come over here, and choose grade. So I'll go ahead and choose grade. There we go. Common color correction nodes are the grade and the color correction node, which is C for color correction. So you can see right here, here's the two. These are the most commonly used, always used like crazy. Most common, you know, besides the roto node, the most common nodes used in color grading and so forth, in color correction and masking. So here's our grade node, and we're just going to go ahead and just play around with this. I'm going to take my Veterus scopes, and let's see if I can split this one more time. And I'm going to take this. I'm kind of running out of space here, but that's all right. Take my Veterus scopes and stick them right here so that I can always see them while I'm playing with the grade node options. Okay. Now, the grade node has a series of options here. It says channels. It tells you what channels you're going to affect. Do you want to color correct just the red channel or the green channel? Or just, you can actually choose, like, I only want to color correct the red channel, okay? So in doing that, if I take gain, you can see I'm only affecting the red channel in here, right? If I turn on red and green, these are changing, but the blue is not nowhere near it, right? And then, of course, these are all on by default here. Sometimes you'll need to color correct your alpha, which is important. But most of the time, again, you'll be color correcting RGB. You also have this clamp black and clamp white. This can be important when you start to ramp up your information. Like, for instance, if I take the gain, which is very much like a multiply operation, I just start to crank it up. Notice I have white clamp not turned on. So if I sample my face here, you'll see my values go above 1, okay? And that is a no-no. You want to have your values normalized or clamped. Now, I can always just come in here and add a clamp node after this. So hit tab and type in clamp and stick that there. Okay, and then look at my viewer through the clamp node. And now if I sample this, you can see the values have been clamped to between the values, the normalized values of 0 to 1. So I'm going to get rid of that and just come in here and do it all in a grade node. The less nodes I have, the better. So I'm going to go ahead and hit white clamp. So now if I sample this, you can see the values are at 1. Again, turn it off. Values are at 3. Okay. There's also black clamp. If I turn that off, right, and I come in here and I take gain all the way down. Let's see, let's take offset and drag it back. Now you can see I've got negative values. These are called sub-blacks. Anything above 1 is called a super white. These values are commonly used in 3D passes, depth passes and so forth that have to have some 3D element to them. But for anything that has to do with footage, it usually needs to be normalized. I'm going to put my bars back. If you ever want to kind of put these at default, you can right-click in the black area here, or the gray area, and say set knobs to default. That'll pop these all the way back, so you don't have to worry about it. So commonly you have both of these on. But later on, you could eventually just, hit the clamp button. You could get some weird artifacting in that respects. So let's talk about black point and white point while we're at it. So black point, as you can see, if I start to take the black point, I could start taking it and crushing my blacks. And what I'm doing is I'm basically going on between the values of 0 to 1. I'm taking like a limbo bar, like the game Limbo where you got to like go under it. And I'm moving that bar, and anything that is to the left of the bar is going to be clipped as 100% black. So as I move this, you'll start to see what's happening here. Why are we? What happened to all that little slope we had? Well, what you're seeing here is all an even higher hill here, but it's all pure black pixels. In fact, this hill should be represented even higher, where it's actually getting higher and higher and higher and higher and higher, meaning every one of these pixels is being pure black or 0. So as I continue to push this, all that data, all these pixels of different variations are slowly getting crushed into what is eventually pure black. And now you have just a stack of, like I was mentioning before, like little Tetris blocks representing each pixel being stacked up as a numerical count of every pixel being at the value of 0. So I'm going to go ahead and put this back. Now the white point's the same way. As I start to pull this back, it's saying any pixel at a 0.43 value, right, or higher is going to be turned into white or 1, right? So if I pull this back, you can see what's happening here. And all these pixels are now moving over here to build a hill on this side, right? So you can't see it, but there is a hill, like there should be like a stack going up way high here. Okay, so I'm going to put that back to 1. Okay, so lift. What is lift all about? Lift is an interesting operation because you have to think of things as an input-output process. As you can see in this graphical representation, that we are going to be manipulating this line, and it has to do with the manipulation of mathematically from 0 to 1. In this case, we are going to be lifting up the absolute blacks, and we're going to go ahead and take that and lift it straight up, but we're going to maintain the absolute whites. And in doing this, we're basically, quote-unquote, lifting the blacks. Now, depending on the quality of the footage that you have, if you got red footage versus crappy, MPEG-4 footage. How much data is in the blacks? How far can you push this? You really don't push it far regardless. But I'm going to go ahead and lift this up and keep lifting it up. And I'm lifting the shadows, but the highlights are staying put, the absolute whites, which we really don't have, but it's lifting the blacks until it just becomes this milky mess, okay? I was actually in virtual reality last night talking to a kid, and he was showing me, he just happened to be a room of film students showing their work, and he had washed out his whites. His blacks were like looking like this, and I just looked at him, and he's like, "Well, I meant to do that." And I go, "Okay, know the rules before you can break them." Sorry, that doesn't look really aesthetically appeasing. It doesn't look good. It doesn't match when you cut back and forth between a montage of footage of stuff that has properly crushed blacks and so forth. It has a specific punch. So you can see the lift. Usually you do just such a small number of this, maybe 0.02 or something, to kind of lift up the details in the shadows here. Again, this is crap footage. This was shot, again, on an A6300, compressed footage, 420. Not a lot of data in there, okay? I mean, if you look in the blacks here, if I lift up the blacks, I'm getting like nothing, okay? So I don't have much to go with in there, just so be aware of it. Again, I could look at that via my exposure. There is some data back there, but not much, okay? Gain is is pretty much a multiplication sort of operation. Same as multiply. There's two of these because later use them for color matching. So gain I can go ahead and pull up, and this is sort of doing the opposite. It's a multiplication process. It's doing the opposite of what you would see in the lift. It's actually locking down the absolute blacks, and it's taking this line and moving it towards. It's just multiplying everything up. So 1 times 1 is, 1, whereas 0 times 0 is 0, so the absolute whites remain, or 0 times 1 is 0, so the absolute whites, the absolute blacks stay still. They don't move, whereas the other end of the spectrum starts to move up. So you can see here as I pull this up, our absolute blacks are staying put, and then slowly everything's coming up. So this is commonly known as exposure. Some would say brightness if you're using like Photoshop or something. All right, now multiply. Let's talk about multiply here. Again, it's the same thing. See if we kind of go up here. There we go. Offset. Offset is an addition and subtraction process. Again, everything's math. What it does is it's going to basically take everything and lift it up. I want you to keep an eye on the waveform here. Let's go back to gain really quick. I want to take a look. As I add gain, you can see this area, the absolute blacks are anchored down, but they're being multiplied out. It's almost like setting a pivot point in 3D space and actually expanding it out. So you can see it's actually stretching it out until you can see it hits a wall here at 100, and then it starts to get crushed. So everything above 100 sort of becomes pure white, right? So usually you want to like put the tip of that at the top, okay? But you don't want to crush any more than that. So you can see the green, this blue hill hits the plateau the fastest, okay? And then green hits, and then eventually red. So it depends on what you're doing, stylistically, if you want to have a blown out face and all that. So I'm going to go ahead and bring that back down to 1. Now watch offset. Offset takes everything and brings it up and down. See that? So the waveform helps you kind of understand what the heck is going on. Now, the other one you have, we talked about lift. Now, look at lift. Lift it's like bouncing the bottom up and down. Again, it's locking the absolute whites up here, and it's scaling it from this position up and down. So you can see it. See it? You can start to see the other things that are going on, such as white point. Kind of similar to exposure, but it's not. Okay, so let's keep going here. We have gamma. Now, gamma is an operation. I'll go ahead and show you the actual curve and the math behind it. And what it's going to do is it's going to lock down the absolute blacks and the absolute whites, and then almost like a bow, a bending bow. It's going to take a sort of a logarithmic operation and take the mid-tone point and then move it up and down. And that's going to play with our midtones. Again, usually we deal with highlights, midtones, and shadows, right? So gamma will actually, you'll see if I take this operation, I'm going to go ahead and just play with it. I'm going to first take the gain up until it kind of hits the 100. So I've kind of done that. And now I'm going to take my gamma, watch my gamma. Keep an eye on my waveform here. You can see it's sort of like staying, it's like in the middle ground, but it's kind of stretching it from the center point now. Right? So you can see if I bring this down, I start to get more crushed values, but my absolute whites and my absolute blacks are staying put. Okay? The values at 0 and the values at 1 are not moving, but the values in between, the midtones, are. So pretty cool. And as we're doing all of this, you're going to always see the Vetroscope kind of play around. Vetroscope's commonly used just for making sure you have proper white balance. Okay. Now, every scene could be different. You might have a blue scene or something, and it's like, okay. But, I mean, generally you want to just make sure that the pixels, you know, are universally in the center and not biased towards one area. Like, for instance, if I take this grade node here, and I start playing around with, say, multiply, and again, what's really cool about this, let me just kind of give some room in here so you can see this, is multiply has a whole bunch of options here in regards to these little pull downs. You have red, green, blue, and then you have alpha. And you also have temperature, magenta, and intensity. Okay. So these you can actually even pull into a bigger menu to be more specific. But I can go in here and start shifting this. So you can see if I take the red and start shifting that, take a look at what's happening in the Vetroscope. Let's kind of like maximize that for a minute. Everything's starting to shift towards this direction, which would tell me my white balance is off, right? So I can adjust that in usually via the color temperature here. So if it was supposed to be more warm, I could push it towards warm. Now you got to understand where is all this coming from? Why this temperature magenta, red, green, blue? Well, it's really simply comes down to a color wheel. You have to understand a color wheel in all its glory here. So if we take a look at a color wheel, magenta's over here, and what's on the opposite side? What's the complementary color? Well, green, right? What's up on the opposite side of, say, orange, right? Or, you know, quote unquote warmth. More of a cyanish blue, right? So there's like temperature, right? Cool and warm. There's green and magenta, right? There's like blue. What is when you take away blue, what do you get? Yellow. You know, when you take away red, what do you get? You know, you just look at the opposite sides of the color wheel. I don't know how far everybody's along as far as their color science knowledge, but always going back to the color wheel is important because it's your roadmap to the colors. It tells you as you take away something, what is being added, and so forth. Because RGB is sort of an additive process of color correction as opposed to, you know, CYMK or something. So let's go ahead and just jump back to my grade here, putting my viewer here. And I'm going to go ahead and just put these all back to default, set knobs to default like that. Now, one of the things is you start to manipulate an object. If I take this gain or something, right? What I can do is I can click on, for instance, little 4 number here, and that'll open up the individual channels. Now, I can come in here with my middle mouse scroll wheel and start to change the values. What I like to do is I'll put a value of 0.001, hit enter, put my cursor on the 1, and then use my middle mouse scroll wheel up and down to slightly change things because everything inside of compositing is seeing or feeling but not seeing. It's real subtleties. You don't make dramatic shifts. The color wheel, if you click on here, opens up the options for these little quick bars. And then if you really want to get geeky, you can go ahead and click the color wheel and hit Control. Control and the little color wheel will pull up the actual grade of each one of these. Okay, like for instance, I'll go to the gain here, and I'll click on the color wheel. There we go. And what I get is this. Now, you have some of these blacked out, like temperature, magenta, intensity, hue, saturation, value, and red, green, blue. So I can turn on all of these, so they're all here. And now I have a longer bar to play with, right? Because here you have, you know, if you take a look at the small bars here, they're very small. Okay, you want to make subtle shifts. You can make this bar very long, you know, up or down. And I can come in here and just slowly start to pull these values. So if I want to pull red, Again, if I want to choose a specific hue, saturation, and value, again, value is sort of, brightness here, you can see. And then you've got right here, magenta or green. Okay. So be aware that you can actually do that. And you also have this little color wheel here. You can move it around too, which is a little bit interesting. So you're talking about the hue and then the amount of saturation and so forth. Again, I come in here and set all knobs to default, bring us back. That's pretty much it for what you would consider to be the grade node. Again, very simple math. We talked about multiplication, and then going back would be division if you go in the opposite way of multiply. So I'll go ahead and hit grade and get rid of that. So let's talk about color correction node. So I'm going to hit C for color correction node. I was recently working with my good friend Rob, who had worked on The Force Awakens. And man, was he showing me some really cool things you can do with this color correction node. Just guy is an absolute genius. But he has done he was showing me some really neat stuff you can do with this. Now, what's the difference between color correction, deal as opposed to the grade node? Well, this allows you to isolate the highlights, shadows, and midtones separately, so it can affect them individually. You have a color correct node and you have a ranges node. So a range node, let me go ahead and pull some of these goodies down. A range node shows you your shadow, what's going to be affected by the shadow inputs, the midtone inputs, and the highlight inputs. And all of these can be changed, which is so awesome. If I select these all together by holding down Shift, you can see I can adjust them independently because one changes the other. So it's basically saying, if you go into color correction node, you have the master, which is saturation, And again, saturation will eventually break if you're dealing with, compressed footage. You can start to see these weird artifacts going on. You can only push this so much. That's why it's important to, upon capture really good color without having to digitally manipulate anything in post to try to get what you were trying to get on set. So everyone's like, well, it's just not, the camera doesn't record really good color. Well, just saturate it. Well, obviously that doesn't work, as you can see here on my chin, especially compressed footage. It just gets nasty. So remember, you can only do so much depending on the quality of the footage that you get, the amount of information. Contrast is basically just crushing your blacks. It's kind of crushing your blacks and whites equally together and bringing them together at a point. And there's also something called roll-off contrast, which sort of does a nice transition as that occurs. So with that said, let's go ahead and just kind of play with these. You've got shadows, midtones, and highlights. They have the same sort of options here as the grade nodes, main options here. So saturation, contrast, gamma, gain, offset. Gamma is exactly like a grade node's gamma. Gain is just like a grade node's gain. And offset is just like a grade node's offset. Same thing, but you have access to it. So this is all information. But what if we wanted to narrow out a range? Maybe we just wanted to play with the areas here and adjust the hue or whatever we want to do, or the brightness values of, say, the brightest areas of the area, which is the face, and this area here. Well, then we might shoot for the highlights or maybe even the midtones. These are so dark they would be considered midtones. So if I go ahead to my ranges, you can see if I go ahead and hold down Control and just start to sample these areas here, they're pretty dark. But you can see this bar moving up and down. It's telling me that this area right here, again, this is a value between 0 and 1, right? If I hit Y to see the luminance value, you can see, where it is, right? So we're going to go ahead and try to isolate that area. So I'm going to go ahead and just kind of scrub around. And I'm going to go ahead and move my midtones way back here, my highlights here. So basically, anything from, is transitioning in slowly, 0.2 or higher, that's going to be my highlights, right? So if I take a look at my highlights, anything from 0.1 or higher is going to be affected. So if I go to my color correction node and I go to my highlights, I can start doing things such as come in here and bring up the gain. And now you can see it's only affecting this area and this area here. It's not affecting my shadows or a little bit of my midtones, but the effect is nasty. I look like I got some kind of like silver paint on my face. And that's because the transition is a little bit too rough. So you can see what I can do is I can transition this up a little bit. So it's going to sort of transition that a little bit smoother. and so forth. So if I just want to get a specific hue, now I'm only isolating this area here. So if I hit D to disable the color correction, you can see I'm only affecting the ranges that are the brightest values here. This is great if you want to digitally manipulate one brightness or luminance area as opposed to keeping your darks kind of allow. So you can see the highlight of my nose is being affected. Little highlights on my skin are being affected. Again, you have to watch out or else your color correction will break. You do too harsh of a transition, it could get nasty. So I'm going to allow for a little bit of a fall off in between the influence. And there you go. Okay. So you're going to do the same thing here with, say, this alien. I'll put my viewer to the alien here, right? So the alien, if I hit Y for luminance, you can see there's a bright values and dark values and all that, right? So I'll hit a C for color correction, plug it in, and we'll go ahead and take a look. And I'm going to go ahead and go to the shadows and adjust like the gain or something. You can see it's only affecting the shadow areas, but not the highlights. These highlights are not moving. And this is all dependent on your ranges. What's the range of considered, midtones and highlights? Well, midtones are this area. Shadows are only from 0 to 0.1. And highlights are roughly from like 0.5, 0.6, 0.7 to 1. So that's the beauty of all this. And all these, just like before I mentioned, you can come in here, you can click, and you can get stuff like this. And little windows. Now, the last thing I want to show you before we sort of end this lesson is the hue correct node. This is commonly to get rid of the kind of nasty green that shows up on someone's face after green screen keying. It's also to manipulate hues. So I'm going to go ahead and actually get rid of all these. I'll put this through to myself and put my viewer through it. Always remember you're looking through the node. If you're looking over here and you're making a manipulation on here and you're going, nothing's working, well, that's because you're not looking at it further down the pipe. Okay, so that's a big mistake all new Nuke users will do. So hue correct allows me to, if I sample, I'm sampling a hue in this situation. And I'm sampling this sort of blue hue that I want to manipulate by itself. And then I can go to saturation, and you can see the line has occurred right here on a cyan. This is basically the color wheel wrapped across from left to right. So I'm going to go ahead and come over here, and I'll just move one of these little dots, and move one of these dots. And then I'll start taking this and changing the hue color. So you can see I can come in here, this is saturation, so SAT, sat, I'm desaturating that area, but I'm not affecting myself or anything, so I hit D to disable, you can see it's just affecting that background. Stylistically, if an art director wants you to do that, you definitely want to do that. Luminance is the same thing, so if I want to just play with the luminance here, bring up the brightness of that area, again I'm isolating it based on a hue. And then finally you can do, such as if I want to add more blue, again I put it right on that line that I sampled and bring it up and down. So now I have more blue, less blue, and again as I move away from blue, I start going to sort of a yellow, right? Be aware that you're moving somewhere on that color wheel. Again, I'll just jump back to the color wheel real quick. And see as I'm moving in one direction away from blue, I'm moving towards this sort of yellow-orange, right? So keep in mind when you pull away from a color, that's what happens. The only difference is in saturation. Saturation just takes your values and brings us down to like grayscale. So just be aware of that. But when you're playing with colors, it's not just that you're getting rid of a color, you're moving the color towards another color. As you kind of add red or add green or remove green or add blue or remove blue, those are pretty much the rate of what's going on. There's also, a lot of these are the same thing. Exposure, again, just being an exposure node. Math, you have add, multiply, gamma. Again, we talked about those. Expressions, sometimes use expressions for color, especially in green screen deals. Saturation node, it's pretty simple. It's just saturation, right? So I come in here and add some saturation. See it going on a color wheel there. A lot of these we're going to talk about in future classes. The last one I want to maybe just talk about is the hue shift. Hue shift is kind of neat. You can come in here and I can come over here and take the hue rotation. You can see I'm changing the hue rotation, or the hue is completely changing. This is if you want to go for that artsy-fartsy look. And it's important as you learn as a filmmaker not to kill yourself by going crazy. You always want to stand out, right? It's like, oh, I want to make a crazy camera angle, super low angle, super high angle. Shoot it at eye line like every film and allow your audience to enjoy your film for the story that what it is, and not just for this obnoxious, over-the-top, in-your-face cinematography, in-your-face color grading. Just tell a story, and that'll tell us whether or not you're a good filmmaker, because filmmakers make a good film, which is a good story. So as we kind of close up the class, I just want to encourage you to know the rules before you break them. Make a good film. One thing that drives me nuts is when you filmmakers out there get one of these fancy cameras, and you're like, finally, I can make my own film. And you run out the door, and you're lazy, and you don't film anything with over-the-shoulder shots. Or if you're doing a 1 or 2 minute film or a 5-minute film, you just follow somebody around walking around a park with some pretentious narration. Yeah, that's great and everything, but it shows lazy filmmaking. You definitely want to take the time as best as you can and write a script, get some good sound, good quality sound. Again, without good sound, you can forget everything. And make a good film. Shoot a nice over-the-shoulder shot. 2 really good actors. Find some good actors. Go to your local theaters. Go to your local cities that have good theaters. Find some actors that need to get into films. Again, that's about what Ridley Scott said. That's like 90% of the job right there, just finding good actors. And make a good film. That's what's really going to stand out. So I encourage you guys, in the midst of all of this stuff, visual effects and so forth, I push against VFX if you're trying to use it to mask bad story. Start with good story, and then from there you'll have a great film. See you next time.